Thank you, everyone, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me and for organizing the conference, since they're all volunteers and have been working, I think, for the last 51 weeks since the end of the last DjangoCon US. Very grateful to them because I know just how much work's involved with that. So when you see a volunteer, give them a thank you or a hug if they permit that. That's me. That's what I look like on television. You can contact me any way you like. I mean, you can contact me on Twitter. It's not something I tend to use, but it's there. I have been involved in Django for more than 10 years now, or not involved in Django, but using Django or trying to use Django. I'm a member of the core development team, and I put that in bold, an ex-vice president of the Django Software Foundation, because people still keep writing to me thinking that I have power, which sadly I no longer have. But it's nice to be thought of as powerful. I work at Devio. We're a company, we offer cloud hosting for web projects. So just to explain, does anybody know what Devio does here? Oh, a few people, okay, well. We're programmers, so I'm sure you've all had the experience of banging your own head with frustration while programming. Well, unfortunately, you're programmers, so that's your problem. We can't help you with that part. But even though it's frustrating, I actually really enjoy programming and writing my modest little web applications. But what I don't enjoy is the other tasks involved in getting them into production. You know, deployment and DevOps and system administration. Has anyone else had the experience of actually being made to cry while trying to configure a system or a web? So yeah. So I was hoping I wouldn't be in a room full of people more manly than me who wouldn't admit to crying about that kind of thing. So programming in Django is one thing, and trying to configure, say, Amazon's web services infrastructure for media storage is quite another. And that's what we do. We take care of that. So you know, your programming problems, they're your problems. We're not going to help you with that. But the other stuff you can leave to us so that you don't have to cry about it. So it's for people who don't want to do DevOps or crying, basically. That's, I think, I'm going to talk to our marketing team and try and explain why this is what we should have on our website. And working with Devio has brought me many, many privileges. And for me, the most important one is my involvement in the African Python movement. Did you know that we held the first PyCon Africa this summer in Accra, in Ghana? Yeah, well, thank you. And sadly, one of my co-organizers, I was the only non-African on the team, but Noah was supposed to be here from Ghana, but I'm afraid your embassy messed up his visa and wouldn't put it right, so he couldn't come. But I think I've been to 7 different African PyCons, and now we had the first Pan-African PyCon, 323 people from many countries. I'd love to talk to anybody about this, so please come and talk to me about that. And maybe, you know, if you're thinking that you might like to visit Namibia or Tanzania or Ghana as a Pythonista, then that's certainly a possibility. So come and talk to me about Devio, about deployment, or any of these things. Right, let's get started. Maybe you know this picture. This is a 16th century fresco by Raphael in the Apostolic Palace in the Vatican. And it's called this, it's kind of subtitled, or it's known as the School of Athens. And it depicts thinkers and scholars, mainly from antiquity. And if you look right in the center, what you see there are Plato, the older one, and Aristotle, who was his most famous pupil. And like all good pupils, he fulfilled his duty not just of learning from his teacher, but also of responding to him too. And Plato's pointing towards the heavens. He's referring to a world that's outside space and time, outside the senses, a world that belongs to the pure forms that the things in our material world are just a kind of shadowy, imperfect copy of. And Aristotle is pointing down into the material world because he argues against Plato that form only exists as the form of substance. and that knowledge and truth require us to generalize from the concrete and the particular to the universal, and not the other way around, as Plato argues. And these two directions, to the heavens and to the earth, they represent probably the single most important axis of thinking in Western philosophy. And the question is, in which direction do we turn to or reach for first? To these universal truths and ideals that lie beyond the senses, or to the material, actual world that lies at our feet, that presents itself? Now, that's not the history of Western philosophy, and don't start, please, thinking that I've told you that everything in Western philosophy can be reduced to that. But what I hope you can see is that this difference represents two distinct directions of thinking, and you don't need to be a student of philosophy to recognize them. And the interesting thing is that people generally recognize themselves in one of those two directions. You right now will have intellectual sympathies that resonate maybe more with Plato or maybe more with Aristotle. And most people seem to know, once it's described to them, which direction is kind of naturally theirs, which one they were born with in a way. That I'm not saying that everybody thinks that they are Platonists or Aristotelians, or that some believe in a world of universal pure forms, but that people do generally find themselves preferring and tending to think in a certain direction over the other. And as I said, you can see this, the axis represented by these two different directions is a key to understanding Western philosophy over the past 25 centuries. Now, I started learning Python just 10 years ago, and I had a very memorable experience. And last time I told this story, more than one person accused me of making it up, and I promise you, what I'm going to tell you is exactly how it happened, I swear it. It was a 5-day introduction to Python and Django, and we were given a really nice handbook. And I practically lived in that handbook. It was always open on my desk, and you see all the marks of my espresso coffee cups, so that's where I put it down. And during that first week of our little training session, I brought it home and I showed it to my girlfriend Carol, and she picked it up and she looked through it, and then she said, "Functions, classes, and attributes, this is Aristotle." And in a way, she was right. So Aristotle's concerned with, in his ethics, he's concerned with virtue, and he argues that the defining human function is a rational activity, and he's very interested in the relationship between what a being is and what a being does, and he talks a lot about the function of things. And I mentioned this the next day to the person who was giving our training, who turned out not just to have a doctorate in artificial intelligence, but to have studied philosophy and theology as well. And he was familiar with these ideas, and so he and I got quite excited. We were talking about this, and there were 3 of my colleagues in the room with us while we were discussing, the function of the human and the human soul and so on. And my 3 colleagues put up with this very patiently for a while, and then one of them announced, "I'm a creationist, and this talk about function and reason is making me feel really uncomfortable." And I wasn't expecting that. And I wasn't sure whether he was teasing me or making a joke, or even if I'd misheard. And I asked him, could he explain? And my colleague Ben said, "You needn't look so surprised. I'm a creationist too." And by this point, my mouth was open, and I wasn't feeling or looking very intelligent. And I wasn't saying anything, but my 3rd colleague said, "Daniele, you're outnumbered. I'm also a creationist." Now, you have to understand, this was literally my subject. I've been teaching philosophy at university for many years. If there was one thing I knew how to do, it was to help people pick their way through these questions and ideas in intelligent and thoughtful ways. So all kinds of questions naturally, immediately occurred to me, like, should we accept Aristotle's account of virtue as a disposition? Or what should we make of his conception of function as defining activity rather than as purpose? And so on. And I had so many of thoughts and questions like this spinning around in my head in quick succession. But the truth is that I was so stunned that the only thing that formulated itself into anything resembling a coherent actual sentence was, what about the dinosaurs? And fortunately, you know, I had enough of my wits left that I didn't say anything. And also, if there's one thing I've learned in life, it's to recognize when I'm outnumbered. So I was intrigued and stunned and surprised, but I didn't pursue the question. But I've never forgotten that experience of how quickly we got from basic concepts in programming to ideas in metaphysics and ontology that weren't just important to academic philosophers, but could resonate with people who hadn't studied this stuff, and, you know, do things like shake and upset people who hadn't studied it and were just listening to conversations about it because they realized there was something profound in these ideas. And shaking people is exactly what important philosophical concepts tend to do. The interesting thing is that philosophical concepts are at work in programming itself, and we find them literally expressed in our code. And when programmers are working with their code, they're also working with philosophical ideas. And the more I've learned about programming, the more obvious it has become to me how deeply embedded in programming these ideas are. And of course, you can expect some of that because, you know, logic is a branch of philosophy, and what is programming if it's not putting together sequences of logical operations? But as the case of Aristotle and functions suggests, it goes deeper and further, and I think it's more interesting. So, as a programming beginner, I was on familiar territory. This connection gave me something to hold on to as I was struggling with programming, a way into understanding programming concepts through things I was already familiar with. I already knew my way around things like attributes and ontologies and identity and truth and nothingness and so on. Even things like types and instances and abstract classes belong to philosophy. I'm not saying I knew what those things exactly meant, but I could at least sing the songs using those words because, you know, I knew that language. In philosophy, they're all troublesome and contested ideas, whereas programmers are very lucky somebody's gone to the trouble of defining them precisely before you even get started. But I was used to tangling with these ideas. And there was another thing that seemed very familiar and that I really enjoyed in my learning programming, and still do, were these kind of declarations about programming, which seem to have a kind of profound poetic mystery about them. So my handbook said, functions are first-class values. And it said, values have type, variables don't. And this reminded me, for example, of Wittgenstein. Truth functions can be arranged in series. Or Immanuel Kant, existence is not a predicate. And I couldn't really judge whether these declarations were true or what their implications were when I encountered them, either in philosophy or programming. You know, were they axioms, discoveries, necessary truths? I didn't know. But even if I didn't completely understand what they meant, I could still sense there was something important and significant about them. And reading statements like these about Python, for example, reminded me of how it was to be studying philosophy and the feelings that I had when I read them. I couldn't judge whether these declarations were necessarily true or false, but they seemed to me to lie very strongly upon a line of truth. It seemed to matter whether they were going to turn out to be true or false or right or wrong. And there were things that I didn't understand the first time or the 15th time I read them, but I seemed to feel a kind of demand that I come back to them again and again until I did. And the things that I read about Python affected me in a similar way. And when you do find yourself confronted with a question that seems to lie upon a line of truth, you feel obliged to follow it and to explore it, to work it out for yourself, and to work out which direction to take along it. And when you find a line of truth, it seems to light up something in the inquiring mind, something really restless and beautiful, something that refuses to be satisfied by shallow or cheap answers, and something that seems to recognize a kind of duty to its own intrinsic value. And that was what drew me to philosophy in the first place, and later when I was a teacher, to see this light up in my own students. And that was one of the deepest pleasures that I had from teaching. And sometimes these kind of gnomic assertions allowed me to feel quite superior. So this is in my handbook. So Python correctly distinguishes between an initializer and a constructor. Many languages, like Java, conflate the two, incorrectly calling this a constructor. And of course, I was filled immediately with a kind of painful pity for the kind of people who might conflate a constructor with an initializer. And I swear I had literally no idea what a constructor might be, but I knew that I would never be confused with the vulgarians who might confuse it with an initializer. And this was another thing that I also found in philosophy in just the same kind of way. So here's Immanuel Kant dispatching certain critics of the Scottish skeptic David Hume. Kant said, they should have penetrated deeply into the nature of reason, a task which did not suit them. Instead, they found a more convenient way of being defiant without any insight, namely the appeal to common sense. And just by repeating those words to myself, I would feel as though I were kind of vanquishing grubby legions of thinkers who imagine deep problems have common sense solutions. Now, just like I learned early in life to recognize when I'm outnumbered, I know how to recognize these sentences that represent superior intellectual firepower. You know, I know which side to be on. So when I started programming, I kept running into surprises that were not unlike the problems that philosophers find themselves with when they confidently pick up something that looks familiar and simple to have a closer look at it. So some of you are familiar with children, or may even have some of your own, but even a child learns to use with confidence simple words like nothing. So what's going on up there? Nothing. And we use these concepts and words dozens of times a day, not just in speech, but in the thinking that represents and orders the world around us. And we do it without hesitation, and we do it without doubt. Nothing is just the absence of something. But just as in philosophy, nothing starts to look more troublesome when you look at it more closely. The programmer who has to deal with nothing runs into similar complications. So one of the most common things that I would have to do as a programmer would be to check for the absence of something. And all of a sudden, it was a complete marvel to me how many different kinds of nothing could exist in programming. And I had to deal with so many of them. There was none, and there was zero, and there were empty lists and sets and other collections. There was the empty string. Then in Django, there was, I discovered a new kind of nothing, null for the database, and then blank for the forms. And they were all different kinds of nothing, and they were all different from each other. So in the Django applications I was building, I needed to represent the world, to construct a picture, not just of its material, of the stuff in it, but of the world's logical form, its logical structure. And here, nothingness was everywhere. Everywhere I looked, it turned out to be key to the logical structure of the representation of the world. I always started thinking about what was in the world, the stuff in it, and always found myself running up about problems, not about the stuff, but about the absence of stuff, how critical nothing turned out to be to the logical representation. And I found myself being obliged to spend a lot of time making decisions about nothing and how to handle nothing. I was working at Cardiff University School of Medicine then, and one of the things my web application needed to do was to be able to represent the members of staff who worked there, record them and information about them, and display them in detail and in lists and so on. So I needed to be able to represent actual people from the world, and I needed a person model to do this in Django. So I had actual persons, and I need to have an adequate account of persons in my own mind, in my own logical representation of the world. I needed to have it in my Django models, in the database where I'd store them, in the forms, and in the output where I'd display them. And all these different kinds of nothingness that I encountered made not just one difference, but different kinds of difference in all these different representations. So just think about a name for a person and the parts of names that people have. which parts of a name can be non-existent? And how do you code or allow for that? What nothingness will you allow in a name, and what combinations of nothingness? How will that nothingness affect how you display them, or list them, or order them, or filter for them? Say you've got to display the list of people in a certain department. And after a while, you realize that it's not just representing the world. You're building a world out of logic. And it's quite a responsibility. And after a while, I started to feel very sympathetic towards God. I was really quite sure that I understood the difficulties that God faced when he was making the world. And I'm the kind of person who appreciates how hard other people's jobs can be. So I felt that he and I must have been in the same kind of business at some level. And names provide us with some excellent examples of the problems that nothing causes us, because they start out looking pretty simple, but, you know. I confess I already found Sting a bit irritating before I became a programmer. So I was aggrieved, but ultimately not really surprised to discover that he could be annoying in a new way. So as a programmer and the God builder of my world, and it could be up to me to say, well, no, Sting, I think you're having one name is pretentious, and I'm not going to allow it, and you'll have to use a name like the normal people do. Tough luck. Sorry. But on the other hand, this is President Sukarno, the first president of Indonesia, and like many Javanese, he only had one name. He didn't have a family name. This is very common. In fact, I discovered the other day that he had 9 times as many wives as he had names, and that maybe is a record for a president. Yeah? So, I felt quite casual about denying Sting the right to have just one name, but it didn't seem fair on all the Javanese. So what could I do about that? Well, you can take account of it in your Django model by allowing null equals true. But that's still not enough. You still need to have a different kind of nothingness for the forms. And it's still not enough, because I still need to deal with this nothingness correctly when it comes to the work of filtering or in my output. So where should Sukarno live in my list of persons when I display them alphabetically? And so it goes on. Nothing turns out to be an awful lot of work, and complex work, because nothingness isn't just a simple business. It touches everything and affects everything it touches. Nothing really does matter. Now, in programming, I found another abiding fascination on the other side of nothingness and negation in being. And, being is to identity as nothingness is to negation. Just as negation has its origins in nothingness, so identity has its origin in being. And both being and identity have they lie in the verb to be. And once again, even a child very early on learns to use that verb correctly and in accordance with the norms. And so does the Python beginner when they start doing their Python. And they use these notions in simple and successful ways. So the new programmer will have read or been told that is refers to identity, whereas the equality operator refers to equality. But in ordinary language, we can say things like 7 and plus 7 equals 14, or 7 and 7 is 14. And there doesn't seem to be too much urgency about distinguishing between these things. And at first, often it will seem to work in ways that you'd expect, and everybody's very happy about that. Until they do something that looks, or they thought looked the same, and then it doesn't work. And they can continue to run into puzzles in which their expectations built on apparently similar outcomes which they've seen apparently similar outcomes of apparently similar operations, and they've built up a pattern. And they run into things like this. We think, yes, that's okay. I can get that. Oops, sorry, what's happened there? Have I messed up my own slides? I think I've messed up my slides a bit. Let me just go back a bit. So they will run into an unexpected result. You might say that, you know, maybe those two things were only superficially similar. I think actually the similarities are quite deep. Only a human would notice them, but the computer doesn't. And the problem, what they're running into is Python's internal metaphysics of being, which will catch them out again and again until they fully internalize it. So here's another example where we have some operations and some operations that maybe look similar, and we're still happy about that. And that's still looking all right. And then all of a sudden they run into something that is like a car crash in their logic, because maybe I should explain this a little bit. So in the first example in the top left, if you do assign 100 to two different variables, A and B, and then ask, is A B? Say, yes, it is. And here we've done exactly the same thing with two other numbers, and although they're equal, they're not identical. And that's because internally Python represents numbers bigger than 256 differently from the way it represents numbers smaller. So there's this stuff going on at this deep level, and if you don't internalize it, you will run into this. What you thought, or what they thought they were asking, wasn't what they were really asking. And in ordinary language, you might get away with it, but in the terminal, you don't. And there's just more of it. Then there's some really fun stuff here. I think this is fun. I think there's a certain kind of fun to be had in exploring this stuff. At least for a certain kind of person, you know, by the time you get to this second last line, you think, what on earth is happening there? But it all hangs together, and it's Python's internal metaphysics. So we use this all without hesitation in ordinary life. But in philosophy, we spilt vast amounts of ink trying to understand those concepts, and we think, oh, people think, you know, what an unnecessary fuss around such small words as is and not. And people lose patience with philosophers when they seem to be making a big deal out of simple, easily understood things. And people don't like it. And you can understand how the appeal to common sense can seem attractive, especially when you know, you've got people making big, complicated, foreign-sounding words about ordinary ones, and even worse, when you have a president also indulging in quibbling about the meaning of the word is. It depends on what the meaning of the word is. So even if you're actually sincerely interested in the meaning of the word is, this was not really a very good look, and the fact that he was visibly squirming and sweaty didn't make it look better. Yeah? So fortunately for us, the Python interpreter has got more patience than a grand jury, and no powers of understanding either. So we had better be sure that we and the interpreter agree on the meaning of the word is whenever we use it. And we'd better understand Python's internal metaphysics of being. So I want to return again to the question of Plato and Aristotle. Carol was really happy to read about functions and attributes in Python because it reminded her of Aristotle, and Aristotle has a lot to say about them. But since we've been contrasting Plato and Aristotle, let's have a closer look. For Plato, our attention should be turned towards the ideal forms of things, because the actual things in our world here, in our world of senses, they're just mere shadows or imperfect copies of those forms. A triangle is only a triangle because the ideal form of a triangle exists somewhere in a realm of forms. The form came first, and that's what makes the instances possible. But for Aristotle, on the other hand, we have to start with the concrete particulars, and form only inheres in those particular objects. And it's only through those objects that we are able to discern the generals, the universals. So for Aristotle, triangles and triangleness both exist, but the form can only be found in actual examples of triangles. And for me, I discovered this aligned nicely with another distinction. The object-oriented programming that we do in Python is class-based. But class-based programming is not the only kind of object-oriented programming. So JavaScript uses prototype-based programming. So in class-based programming, we define abstract classes that we instantiate as objects. So we go from the abstract to the concrete. But in prototype-based programming, we create concrete objects that we then clone. In class-based programming, we make new things from other things that then inherit from existing ones. But in prototype-based programming, new things are objects that inherit from existing objects. So in class-based programming, as in Plato, the ideal form of an object, the blueprint, the class that defines it, exists in and of itself. Whereas for Aristotle or prototype-based programming, the general form only exists through the concrete objects. Which means that Plato is to Python as Aristotle is to JavaScript. And so Carol was wrong when she said it was Aristotle. It was Plato, really. But she wasn't a programmer, so she didn't know. And I didn't know this until quite recently. So here we are back again with Plato and Aristotle. And Plato's pointing upwards for the source of truth, the realm of ideas, and the abstract, and Aristotle's referring to the concrete world at his feet. And to say that one is right and one is wrong is not the point. But I think it's a difference that kind of demands that we take sides in some way. And most of Western, hello. Yeah. Most of Western philosophy seems to have been the history of taking sides on this. And any debate right now, for example, between a pragmatist and an idealist can also be overlaid on this. I'm not saying that a modern idealist or pragmatist is a Platonist or an Aristotelian, just that you can see how these things line up, that you can see in the two different approaches, the two different ways of thinking, directions of thought that clearly align and fit with those of Plato on one side or Aristotle on the other. So they lived 25 years ago, but their ideas are still alive and kicking and at work, and we can engage with them. And I love that. And for people who are a bit argumentative like me, it means you can have an argument with someone who died 2,500 years ago, and what's more, they're still answering back. So let's go back to this question for the final time of Plato or Aristotle, which is the one for us, which is the one that speaks most directly or deeply to us. And in a way, I have two answers for this. One is, I don't have to choose. Because how can you choose between Plato or Aristotle? But it depends a bit on my mood, because sometimes the answer is Plato, obviously. So here for the very last time, here's Plato and Aristotle on the walls of the Apostolic Palace, all eyes on them, the center of attention around which everything else is revolving, pointing up and pointing down. And here's John Travolta in Saturday Night Fever, and all eyes are on him. He's the center around which everything revolves, and he's also pointing up and pointing down at the same time. And the two directions that John Travolta gives us give us a line, and it's a line of truth. He's giving us a dimension. We can choose a direction on that line, but we don't have to. The important thing is not that you have to choose and declare this direction to be yours, but to be aware of that dimension. And like John Travolta, that dimension contains both directions at once. And we must live on this dimension. We must find our way on this line of truth. And as I said before, when you find yourself confronted with something that seems to be a line of truth, you feel obliged to follow it and explore it, to work out for yourself which direction to take along it. And that was the force of the demand that I felt in philosophy, to respond and demand, to respond and engage with the kinds of demands and questions that they raise. And the interesting thing for me is that of all the people I've met in the world, the ones who respond most strongly to those questions are programmers. And I don't know why. Maybe it's because people who become programmers are already disposed to being alive to those questions, or maybe programmers does something to people and changes the way they think. And it's not just that they're alive to these questions, they also seem to be well-equipped to tackle them. I've never met any other population of people who can, and including academic philosophers, who can think and talk about philosophical questions as intelligently and wisely as programmers can. And it's an experience I've had again and again. There's something in programming that gives people insights into certain kinds of philosophical questions and a clear grasp of certain concepts. And the conversations that I've had with programmers about these things have been consistently more enjoyable and rewarding than the ones I've had, for example, with students or colleagues even, or as enemies, as I like to refer to them in academia. And I'm sure that if programmers became philosophers, they'd have something really something to say that would be worth hearing. So here's Immanuel Kant's treatment of nothingness in the Critique of Pure Reason. And honestly, you should maybe read it one day. It's equal in technical rigor and depth to anything that a programmer could think of. And I would love to see a programmer, rather than some lazy philosopher, get their teeth into, a philosopher-programmer get their teeth into something like that. Or this is his analysis of judgment, which he describes as logical. Judgment is a logical function of unity for Kant. There's that word, functions, again. And I'm sure that a programmer philosopher would have something more valuable to say than the mountains of rubbish I've had to read, including, and I'm not talking about students' essays, I'm talking about books that I went out and bought with my own money from people I've fortunately never met for them. And there's so many places to go and things to think about that are connected directly to these concepts in programming. So we have being and nothingness, and substance and consciousness, or identity and negation, or equivalence and difference, or positivity, that is, what actually is, and normativity, which is what should be, or objecthood versus becoming. And these all lie there on that distinction between being and nothingness. And this goes wider and further and deeper maybe than you imagine. Plato argued that until philosophers become rulers or kings, or kings become philosophers, a truly just society would be impossible. Well, I've seen how philosophers manage to run a philosophy department, so I don't have my hopes up for the philosopher king. And I have to admit that 30 years ago when I was a young academic, I found it quite an attractive notion, but with a bit of distance, the idea has come to seem a little less implausible. On the other hand, we could have programmer kings, and I think, no, thank you very much. I wouldn't like that very much either. Programmers already have more power than I think is safe to have in their hands, because their ways of thinking, programmers' ways of thinking, are responsible for, they find expression in the construction of our world. They are responsible and becoming increasingly responsible for the way we live and the way we communicate and so on. And we can talk about that another time, but I don't think there's any evidence to suggest that they'd be better kings than philosophers would be. But on the other hand, the idea of programmer philosophers, I think that is something else. Programmers are made for this. I think they're genuinely good at it. And I find it nothing less than fascinating that they are. And I continue every time I meet them to have these fascinating encounters with programmers that illuminate and add new dimensions to the philosophy that I studied for so many years and that has been one of the most important things in my life for most of my life. So to the programmers, I just say thank you for all the conversations, and I hope that we will have many more. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniele. I'm always entertained when I see your talks. You talk about philosophers and programmers as if they are two distinct groups. Do you think there is benefit in people who are programmers? I know that I didn't encounter philosophy until a PhD program, and even then reluctantly. Would there be benefit in programmers spending more time reading philosophy, either to inform the decision-making process around the ways we're ruining the world, or to understand the programming that we're actually doing better?
Actually, that's a really interesting question, and I was thinking about this. programmers tend to be smart, clever, fast-thinking people, but they don't always have the opportunity to become very deep thinkers about things. And this is why so many of the things that programmers come up with when they, for example, have a social implication look so horrendous. You know, what looks like a really smart idea to a clever 23-year-old isn't necessarily very wise or profound. And I think perhaps that might be a dimension that the study of philosophy has to offer for programmers. Whether it would make their programming any better, you know, I don't think it's made me a great programmer, or, you know, maybe there's another reason why I'm not a great programmer, but I think it would certainly be valuable to their thinking, yes. So there's a difference between being a fast, smart, clever person and being somebody who is a profound thinker.
Any more questions? All right, let's give another round of applause to Mr. Daniele.